In this operations management tutorial, we will look at capacity planning. We will look at capacity planning for both manufacturing and services. This tutorial will be focused on the strategic side of capacity planning. My students can access the video tutorials for the problems in this topic using the content menu in D2L. YouTube viewers can access the problem video tutorials by signing up for my course on udemy.com. I have a long and short version of the URL posted on the screen. And I will post both of these in the description for this video. What is capacity? One definition is the upper limit or ceiling on the load that an operating unit can handle. Operating unit can mean a machine, department, or any group on which it makes sense to measure this output it is capable of producing. When planning around capacity, there are three very basic questions that you must address. The first is what kind of capacity is needed. In a factory, this might be, do you need more low-speed drill press capacity or do you need more high-speed drill press capacity? In a restaurant, this might be, do you need more four-person tables or do you need more larger tables? The second question is how much capacity is needed. Add too much and you spend too much money on the addition. Add too little and you will still be short of the capacity you need. Since many machines are only available in certain sizes, you may not be able to get exactly the capacity you need, making this a more difficult question. The third question is when do you need the capacity? Add it too soon and you are spending money sooner than you need to. Add it too late and you are missing sales. This is an especially important question in services, where a major component of adding capacity is adding employees. I mentioned that we would be addressing the strategic side of capacity. There are a number of reasons why all capacity decisions can be seen as strategic decisions. 1. The capacity decisions you make now impact both your cost structure and your ability to meet demand into the future. The more difficult it is to add capacity, the longer into the future your costs and ability to meet demand are impacted. For example, a new factory might take up to 2 years to build and become operational but is then expected to run for 30 or more years. That is 30 years of affecting your costs and your ability to meet demand. 2. Adding capacity affects operating costs, both now and into the future. Notice that I said affects rather than raises operating costs. If you replace an old, slow machine with a faster, more modern machine, your capital costs go up by the cost of buying and installing the machine, but it might just lower your operating costs by being both faster and easier to operate. I consulted with one factory that replaced a group of several machines with one automated machine. The new machine ran faster, had less scrap and waste, and replaced 5 workers with one robot. Capital costs went up but operating costs dropped dramatically due to lower wages, less waste, and less scrap. Additionally, since it ran faster, the fixed costs could be spread out over many more units. So, while total capital costs went up, the cost per unit actually went down. 3. The capacity decisions you make are a major determinant of the cost of adding that capacity in addition to future costs. That automated machine I mentioned earlier cost well over $1 million. That is an initial cost since the company had to pay it up front. The savings came later, once the machine was installed and operational. 4. Adding capacity is usually a long-term commitment, especially in manufacturing. That $1 million machine I mentioned earlier was expected to run for at least 20 years. I worked for an electric power company for many years. Any new baseload power plant we built was expected to be operational for at least 50 years. Not all capacity decisions are long-term, however. This is especially the case in services. A tax firm can hire part-time employees in March and April to help with the flood of income tax preparation and then let them go after April 15th. A restaurant can hire new servers when demand is high and later lay them off or schedule them less if demand drops. 5. Capacity decisions affect competitiveness. One way it does this is by impacting your cost structure. I described earlier how, in some situations, capacity additions can lower operating costs. That can translate into lower prices which would then make the firm more competitive. Capacity decisions also affects competitiveness by determining how much demand the firm can handle. There is a fast food restaurant near my house that has long lines at the drive-thru for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They are basically running at full capacity during periods of peak demand. Many times, I have seen cars drive by, see the long line, and decide to go to a competitor. I have also seen cars get into line, get tired of waiting, and leave. The technical term for this is balking. Given the size of their building and parking lot, this particular fast food restaurant is operating at its peak capacity. But, if they could add capacity, they would get more business and, as a result, their competitors would get less business. 6. Capacity decisions can affect how easy or hard it is to manage the production facility. And note, adding capacity does not necessarily make management harder. Take the fast food restaurant I mentioned earlier. With long lines, any mistake anyone in the facility makes just makes serving all those customers more difficult. If they could add capacity, it would give them a buffer when a mistake happened, making managing easier. Or, take the $1 million machine I mentioned earlier. It replaced several older machines that were prone to breaking down. That made them a major management headache. With the replacement machine, there were far fewer breakdowns. Plus, there were fewer workers to call in sick, take vacation, or make mistakes. All that made it easier to manage the facility. This is not always the case. Adding capacity can make management more difficult. Imagine a power plant with one turbine. The technical term is unit. The power company could add capacity to that plant by building a second unit, and this is fairly common. That new unit has a bunch of new equipment and requires adding workers. In this case, adding capacity makes managing the facility more difficult. 7. Globalization adds a lot of complexity to many capacity decisions because you have to decide if you are going to add the capacity locally or in another country. The tax firm I mentioned earlier could, instead of hiring local workers, use their existing workers to collect data from clients and then outsource the actual tax preparation to workers in India. This is actually not all that uncommon. And, the more correct term for sending work to another country is offshoring. Even that fast food restaurant I mentioned earlier could offshore. In order to understand, you need to know that most major fast food chains are franchised, and it is not uncommon for someone to operate many different locations. I know of one franchisee for a major fast food chain that offshored the drive-through ordering to India. When you pulled up to the menu to place your order, the person taking the order was in India and you were connected over the internet. Once you have completed your order, the person in India would send it to the local kitchen to prepare via the internet. Of course, not all firms can consider offshoring. A small manufacturer or your local gym is going to have all their work done locally. And 8, as we have talked about, capacity additions have long-term impacts. That means you need to be doing long-range planning to make sure that capacity addition will make sense in the future. An electric utility building a plant or unit that they plan to keep operational for 50 years, needs to be fairly sure that they are going to need that capacity well into the future. And, it is more complex than even that sounds. The electric utility industry is transitioning to greener energy sources like water, wind, and solar. So, it is not enough for a utility to know they will need the capacity into the future, they need to be fairly sure that this is the type of capacity that makes sense in the future. So, a utility that is absolutely sure they need to add generating capacity might decide to forego a coal-fired power plant because that is not the type of green power they feel they need in the future. In fact, they might be both shutting down coal-fired power plants, in other words reducing capacity, while at the same time replacing that capacity by adding green power. While it might not sound like it, there are several different ways to measure capacity. Let's look at them. Design capacity is the maximum output rate or service capacity an operation, process, or facility is designed for. A restaurant with 40 seats has a design capacity of 40. Most motorcycles have a design capacity of 2. Effective capacity is design capacity minus allowances such as personal time, maintenance, and scrap. For example, a machine might be designed to produce 100 units an hour, but if it requires 1 hour of maintenance for each 8-hour shift, then its effective capacity is 700 per shift. Effective capacity will be less than design capacity. The actual output is the rate of output that is physically achieved. This cannot exceed effective capacity but is usually less. The machine mentioned a moment ago might have an actual output of less than 700 if the workers take breaks. So, how do we measure capacity? It is not as straightforward as you might think. The best way, if it is possible, is to measure capacity in units. An electric power plant, for example, has its capacity measured in megawatt hours. A megawatt is 1000 kilowatt hours. Okay, that sounds easy. Now, what about a doctor's office? They might have the capacity to perform 32 physicals a day but only have enough capacity to handle 12 heart attacks. What is their capacity? Or, what about my barber? She can cut my hair in 15 minutes or so. While my wife goes to a different person, it takes her over an hour to get her hair cut. If one person handled both men and women's haircuts, what would be their capacity? When a facility produces one product or provides one service, capacity is easy to measure. When it produces multiple products or provides multiple services, capacity can be much harder to measure. Often, the solution to this problem is to measure capacity in dollars. So, we might say that a doctor has the capacity to generate $10,000 of revenue a day. That gives us a way to express capacity without directly considering the different types of patients the doctor sees. However, this has a number of problems. If the doctor raises their prices, then it can look like their capacity went up, when, in fact, they just had price inflation. A change in design can cause the same issue. Suppose our doctor started using a physician's assistant to see the simpler, and therefore less expensive, patients while the doctor took on more complex patients. As a result, the doctor's billings went up but their capacity did not change. One way around this is to base capacity on inputs. The doctor can see so many patients per day or has so many hours per day to see patients. A hospital has so many beds it can fill. It is not a great solution, but oftentimes it is the only solution that is available. Efficiency is the ratio of actual output to effective capacity. In other words, it tells you how well or poorly you used its effective capacity. Utilization is similar. It is the ratio of actual outputs to design capacity. So, how effectively you are using that design capacity. As I mentioned at the start of this video, my students can find tutorials on how to calculate efficiency and utilization in the content menu of D2L. YouTube viewers can find those same tutorials at udemy.com using the link in the description. As I mentioned earlier, effective capacity is less than design capacity. In other words, your machine might be designed to produce 100 units per hour but is actually averaging only 90. Why might that be the case? There are actually a number of possible causes. The first is the facilities you are using. Just because a machine can produce 100 units per hour does not mean that the machine before it in the process is capable of feeding it 100 inputs per hour. Or, perhaps the facility is not able to feed it raw materials fast enough to allow it to hit 100 per hour. Your product or service might be designed in such a way that the equipment you are using cannot hit its maximum capacity. For example, a restaurant might have a stove with a design capacity of 50 burgers per hour but not have enough drive-through capacity to allow customers to order 50 burgers per hour. It is possible that processing factors, such as a cramped production facility, limits a machine's ability to process at a certain speed. Or perhaps there is not enough compressed air, for example, to run at design capacity. Just because a machine has a design capacity of 100 per hour does not mean that its human operators can work that fast. Even if they can, you have to consider the possibility of mistakes. Especially in services, it is common for humans to be the limiting factor. Management policies can also be a factor. For example, management might have a policy that limits the amount of inventory a facility can carry. That could cause a machine to be operated at below its design capacity in order to keep inventory below that limit. Operational factors, such as a dull drill bit, can be a factor as well. Supply chain factors can also be an issue. You depend on your supply chain to get you the raw materials that you need for your processes. When that breaks down or cannot supply material in the volumes you need, it will naturally limit your capacity. I have worked with enough companies to know that this is a more common issue than you might think. Finally, external factors might limit capacity. For example, the government regulates how many hours a day that truck drivers can drive. The truck might have the design capacity to operate 24 hours a day, but the driver does not. And it is not just the government. Unions also commonly have these sorts of limits. Capacity strategy is based on assumptions the company makes. We will now briefly discuss those assumptions. The first is the expected long-term demand patterns. For example, when an electric utility adds a large power plant, it is expecting demand to grow over the long term. If they are right, revenue and profits go up. If they are wrong, then costs go up without revenue growing proportionally and therefore profits go down. Another issue can be anticipated technological changes. For example, in the 1970s, most household appliances were far less efficient than they are today. Had power companies planned for the future while assuming that inefficiency would continue, they would have more capacity than they needed. Of course, technology can also increase demand. Think about all the people charging electric cars at home today. No power company considered that in their planning 20 years ago. Finally, you have to consider the behavior of your competitors. Where I live right now, there tends to be very long lines at the coffee shops like Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts, especially in the morning. I have seen the lines wrapped around the building. Starbucks might plan to expand its capacity to get more customers. That makes sense unless Dunkin' Donuts also expands. Then, both of them have increased their costs without the number of coffee customers increasing. There are 8 steps to capacity planning. Step 1 is to estimate future capacity requirements. Depending on the company and the industry, there could be multiple areas that need to be estimated. For example, a hospital might need to estimate its future needs for emergency room capacity, operating room capacity, beds, ICU capacity, and so on. An electric utility might need to estimate both its base load needs and its peaking needs. A fast food restaurant might need to estimate both its drive-through needs and its dine-in needs. If it also delivers, it might need to estimate those needs as well. Step 2 is to evaluate your existing capacity needs in each area. If you have adequate capacity, then you are done. Otherwise, you would continue on to the next step. Step 3 is to identify alternative ways to meet the capacity needs identified in Step 2. For example, the fast food restaurant might add a line to increase drive-through capacity and partner with a delivery service to increase delivery capacity. So, not all the capacity needs have to be met the same way. Step 4 is to conduct a financial analysis. This has 3 major objectives. The first is to decide if it makes sense to add the needed capacity. It might, or it might not, depending on your market and your competitors. Assuming that adding the capacity makes sense, then the second is for those areas where there is more than one possible approach, you are looking for the capacity addition that makes the most economic sense. Finally, the third is to decide how much capacity to add. It might, for example, make more sense to add more capacity than you need right now to have a buffer for future demand increases. Step 5 is to look at any qualitative issues not considered in Step 4. For example, would one approach impact quality more than the other? Our fast food restaurant might decide not to partner with a delivery company, for example, because they are concerned about the delivery quality of that company. Step 6 is to pick one of the alternatives we are studying for each area that needs additional capacity. Step 7 is to then implement the alternative we picked. For example, go out and add the second drive-through line. Finally, Step 8 is to monitor the results. We need to make sure the approach we picked is delivering the capacity improvements we expected. We also want to make sure we did not overlook anything in order to improve our future analysis. Now, let's talk about some things that are unique to service capacity planning. First and foremost, services need to be close to their customers. How close depends on the particular service. You might only be willing to drive 10 miles to go to a particular fast food restaurant, but you might be willing to drive 100 miles to see a medical specialist that you need to see. What that means is that with services, capacity and location are closely related. The number of customers McDonald's can serve in my town depends on how many McDonald's are close enough that people are willing to drive to them. Second, services cannot be inventoried the way that manufacturing output can be inventoried. The long lines at Starbucks at 8 a.m. cannot be addressed by making coffee the night before to sell the next day. They have to make the coffee fresh and deliver it when it is demanded. So, with services, it is not enough to estimate the capacity you need. You also have to estimate the timing of the demand. Since one of the major determining factors of the capacity of a Starbucks is the number of employees working, they have to make sure to schedule enough workers during peak demands. Third, services have much more volatility of demand than does manufacturing. The Starbucks near my house has a very long line at 8 a.m. but almost no line at all at 2 p.m. While they can vary staffing and have more people working at 8 a.m. and fewer working at 2 p.m., they cannot vary their facility. They either build a facility that can handle the 8 a.m. demand or they lose sales. Having that higher facility capacity means their capacity is very underutilized at 2 p.m. I am now going to briefly mention the various ways you can evaluate capacity expansion. These are all calculations, so I am not going to go into them in any depth. That is what my problem video tutorials are for. As I mentioned at the start of this video, my students can find video tutorials on how to perform these calculations in the content menu of D2L. YouTube viewers can find those same tutorials at udemy.com using the link in the description. Cost volume analysis is where you find the break-even point. That is the point where the cost of an expansion exactly equals the revenue from that expansion. If the volume is less, then you lose money. If the volume is greater, then you make money. It is a fairly simple approach and is often used as a first cut before looking at the problem in more detail. It can also be especially helpful in deciding between different approaches once you know for sure you are expanding capacity. By far the most common approach is a financial analysis. With this, you look at the current costs and the future cash flows and convert everything back to its present value. This is often called its NPV. If it is positive, the expansion is financially viable. If it is negative, then the expansion is not financially viable. Decision theory is looking at discrete options with known probabilities. Waiting line analysis is a way of looking at how fast customers can make it through one or more waiting lines. For example, Starbucks might use waiting line analysis to estimate how much quicker it could serve customers by adding a second drive-through line. Finally, a computer simulation is a way of looking at decisions when you only have rough approximations of probabilities or other inputs. Let's conclude by summarizing the strategic implications of capacity decisions. First and foremost, it is critical to recognize that capacity planning impacts every area of the firm. If you increase capacity, then marketing has to sell more. HR has to hire more employees. IT has to expand the network. Purchasing has to buy more raw materials. And so on. Capacity additions have a long-term impact on the firm. They set the conditions the firm will operate under for the life of that capacity expansion. If it is possible to add flexible capacity, then the firm can be more agile. After all, a firm can only react to changes in its marketplace as quickly as it can reconfigure its capacity to meet the evolving needs. However, it is not just using the capacity to be more flexibly, it is also about using the high volume it can produce with the extra capacity to improve its flexibly. Having more flexibility reduces the firm's dependency on getting the forecast correct. A manufacturing firm can also use inventory for this, but a service does not have that option. It is important to have a capacity expansion strategy that makes sense for the firm and its position in the marketplace. Will it add capacity early to be ready for growth in the marketplace, or will it wait and see if the demand materializes before adding the capacity? Finally, it is important to realize that not every market is expanding. Some firms are seeing a contracting market and are therefore looking at shedding capacity, rather than adding capacity. This is called capacity contraction. Capacity can be reduced by selling off plants, closing plants, or reconfiguring plants to make other products. In services, capacity can be reduced by laying off workers or closing facilities.